the notion that somehow we are discovering fundamental truth is one that I've had to put away because I don't believe it anymore.
Brian Greene is one of the world's leading theoretical physicists, a best-selling author and master storyteller of the cosmos.
We are inventing mathematical descriptions, and the best physicists tell the best mathematical stories.
He spent a lifetime wrestling with the multiverse and the deep structure of reality.
It's got to be adventurous. Like maybe that last meal should send you off.
But what does someone who's devoted their life to unraveling the nature of existence contemplate when facing the end?
When death is really staring you in the face, you all should be excited. Because, if there is something else, I'm about to find out.
Food defines us, but every feast must come to an end. When facing mortality, life's big questions are served.
This is Last Meal, where I prepare the dish my guest would want if it were their last.
I've been asking everybody this question in the last couple of weeks. And you, as a native New Yorker, you were born here, right?
Yes.
Okay. What is your favorite thing about New York?
The pollution, the noise, the accents. My favorite thing about it is that it's only here that I feel fully plugged in. Anywhere else in the world, I always feel like I'm in a suburb, regardless of, it could be London or Paris, and it just sort of somehow feels peripheral to the center. Now, maybe it's because I grew up here, maybe it's because it's New York and there's sort of everything here, but that is the feeling I always have.
Yeah, I've likened it to, it's not as much that you feel it being here, but you've noticed when you're leaving.
Yeah, for sure.
There's just some things that just aren't available to you anymore. It's the city.
And there's a feeling that I just can't quite replicate anywhere else. Now, look, I've never lived in a big city for anywhere near the length of time that I lived here. Maybe if I had 20 years in London or Paris, it would feel different. But,
yeah. I was walking around Midtown East couple of weeks back, and there was this parade that was on, and I don't know what it was for, but it was a huge production. It was like 500 Chinese people, all with big banners, something written in Mandarin, and a lot of them were dancing, some were hitting drums, and it was spectacular.
Yeah.
And no one's watching. This is just going down Lexington, right? Like they were stopping traffic, right?
Sure.
And there's a couple of people that are just like having smoke breaks outside the building and just like watching.
Right.
And I walked up to one of them and I was like, "What's going on here?" He's like, "I don't know." I was like, "That's what I love about New York. I love because you wouldn't find that in any other city." But it's just random entertainment for whoever's outside having a cigarette at that moment. But it's higher production value than you would see anywhere else.
Right.
And it features things daily that you can interpret in a positive or a negative way. I could see that as it's getting in my way because I got to go to a meeting, like fuck this parade.
Yeah.
Or it could be like, how special is it to be in this city where we just get this random entertainment?
No, totally. And look, the other night, my wife and I didn't feel like doing the usual movie, TV, or something like that. We went to Museum of Modern Art for a lecture on the colors red, blue, and black. Right? I mean, a Friday night lecture on red, blue, and black. 3 different people. It was wonderful.
Yeah,
totally spectacular.
That sounds incredible.
Yeah.
Why did you want to get into it, or what's the gist of it?
Well, it was an artist who I'd vaguely heard of but didn't know much about, named Jack Whitten. And I know that name because Edward Whitten is the world's famous physicist. And so this is an artist in the 60s and 70s in New York who did these wonderful pieces. And they had these 3 scholars and artists talking about his work and how he leveraged color to do these amazing things. So yeah, it was so quite an evening. Like, only New York.
That's the New York version of Netflix and chill.
Yes, right. Which we also do, the usual version.
Yeah. You spend a lot of your time either zooming out to try to understand some of the largest things in the universe, the cosmos, all that sort of stuff, or conversely zooming in to inspect subatomic behaviors, activities, and phenomenon. Like, how do you manage living in the middle?
Yeah. Well, it's a funny thing. When you spend your time, as you're saying, thinking about stars and galaxies and black holes or molecules, atoms, quarks, and things like that, in the end of the day, you're able to kind of recognize that there's this continuum from the small to the big. They're not as separate as they may seem. And then ordinary life has its place on that spectrum. And so I think many of us, I can only really speak for myself, but I think many physicists sort of freely find themselves navigating between the small and the big and negotiating between the big and the small, and it's just the way we live our lives. So it isn't like you have to turn off your cognitive explorations in order to get back to day-to-day existence. It's just part of how we live.
So is it, that was going to be my next question, was that, is it something that you switch on and off? Because, I mean, there's a certain layer to life where you could inspect it almost on a molecular, like you're eating food or something like that.
Sure.
Are you tasting the chemical composition of the food, or are you sort of noticing the effect that it has on your consciousness? Or are you just enjoying the pizza or whatever?
I wish I could say just enjoying it. Yeah. My son in particular is always like, Dad, you don't always have to be digging deeper into things, man. Just enjoy it and experience it.
So you do that.
I do that. I do find myself, even in the early days when I was just learning Einstein's ideas of like special relativity, which tells you that time elapses differently depending on how you're moving, or general relativity, the gravity you're experiencing. And I would find myself walking down the street, moving relative to, say, one of those folks that you mentioned who was watching the parade and just, having a smoke, and thinking, wow, our time is elapsing differently because we're moving relative to each other. These kind of thoughts would certainly, and still do, just kind of inject themselves in day-to-day life. And so I feel like and maybe even I try to experience things on many levels at the same time, and it's become more second nature after doing it for decades. So, I think I do enjoy things, but I am also often analyzing in a way that perhaps, it can be a distraction. And most people think, what are you doing?
Yeah, most people wouldn't, or they probably couldn't, without the knowledge that you seem to be somewhat burdened with at times.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of like anything else, right? It's like whatever your human nature is, like you could use that for good, or you could use it to annoy yourself.
Yeah.
Like there is, to an extent, you could be splitting hairs over reality, every experience you're having, and losing your ability to enjoy it. But you could also use it to keep your life in perspective.
That's right. I think it's a perspective, or one that really is a description that resonates most with me, because I do constantly find myself pulling back and saying, okay, you're having this deeply human experience, but in the end of the day, you're just a collection of particles governed by physical law, and that's all that's really responsible for everything that you're thinking and feeling. And I think that's where my son sort of says, okay, give it a rest.
Yeah.
Because he sort of experienced this way of being through me since he was very young. I think perhaps more than my daughter, my son and I have sort of somehow engaged in this kind of exercise. And at times, it hasn't been the most pleasant way of being in the world for him. He's found it disturbing. At times, and emotionally difficult at times to sort of constantly be thinking about things this way. So,
do you think that there's an intrinsic link between knowledge and wisdom, or do you think that they're separate?
I think they're definitely separate. I don't consider them disconnected. I almost think of knowledge as the raw material for wisdom. I think wisdom absent knowledge, perhaps it's intuition that's driving the wisdom, but it can become unmoored, ungrounded. And to me, the deepest kind of wisdom is wisdom that takes knowledge of the facts, if you will, or the situation, or the quote-unquote truth, whatever that means, and finds a way of integrating it with humanity, human emotion, sensibility, human reaction, human discourse, human engagement, human relationships. So when all of those very human qualities are informed by a deep knowledge of what is true about the world, that to me is when the entirety integrates into a way that I think is powerful and gratifying.
I was a couple of years ago sitting on the rooftop in a hotel here in Manhattan, and it was a rooftop bar at a hotel, and it looks west over Jersey City. And I was there for drinks with a friend, and it was about when sunset was going down. And when the sun goes down right behind the buildings of Jersey City, it just is this magnificent, sunset.
Yeah.
And I remember watching everybody on the rooftop just gravitate to the edge as soon as the sky kind of lit up in this beautiful like hues of magenta and purple and all this stuff. And they all unanimously took their phone out and just started taking photos of it, right? And I get that. I'm happy to take a photo of something, but then also enjoy it in the moment. I saw a lot of these people take the photo and then turn their back to the sunset and start editing the photo.
Right.
That's one approach. Another approach might be to enjoy it, but take your photo. Might your approach be to watch it, enjoy it, but then start thinking about how those hues were created by, longer spectrum photons being allowed to pass through an angle of the atmosphere?
I wouldn't want to go as far as to say that it always segues into the analytical.
Yeah.
But I do share exactly what you're saying. I rarely take photos of things that feel like I'm connecting to them emotionally, because I consider that experience to be of the moment, and I don't need to try to capture that moment in something that will transcend time. And what's a photograph meant to be? It's meant to take a moment and spread it out through time so that it exists at moments that are distinct from the moment when it was actually happening. And I don't feel that need. I consider, in some sense, the moment, any moment, is eternal. I don't want to get like overly like poetically philosophical here.
Yeah.
But, one of the things that we learn when you think about time scientifically is that moments just are. They don't exist and then go away. They are forever populating that instant in time. And I just sort of really embrace that way of thinking about things. So I don't try so hard to hold on to a given moment in that way.
Yeah. And so do you think that our minds or our consciousness, by dint of that belief, are kind of like these computational methods of turning the raw materials of information into something that's greater than the sum of its parts, at least, from the subjective point of view of the person viewing a sunset or listening to a song or eating a meal?
Yeah, I would say that, but I would also add to it that our senses are incredibly selective. We are bombarded by stimuli at every single instant, and presumably evolution by natural selection has equipped us to pare away those aspects of the environmental influence that just don't matter from the point of view of survival. And so we take this limited sieve-like approach to the data, the influences that are impinging upon us, and then we integrate that limited data into narratives, into stories, into experiences, which wonderfully now go well beyond merely survival. They've taken us to wondrous insights that don't really affect whether we live or die, but certainly enrich existence. I mean, to look out into the world and see that sunset, and to be able to describe the wavelengths of light, and to understand why it is that the eye of a human is sensitive to certain wavelengths. Again, it's because the sun emits light in particular wavelengths. And so an eye that was sensitive in the part of the spectrum that the sun bathes the earth in makes a lot of sense from the point of view of evolution by natural selection. So all of that are great and enriching insights that you don't need to know to get the next meal, but they certainly make getting the next meal all the more wondrous.
I like the point that you were making about how it serves a very narrow frame of a spectrum of, what our senses are, and from an evolutionary standpoint, what we've prioritized.
Yeah.
And it makes me think that we could be doing a lot more things to subjectively improve our experience in life and to live better lives for ourselves. Do you think that there's any, not necessarily like objective overarching rules that we could live by or anything, but do you think that there are some aspects to a life well lived that we could be better following?
Well, I think it's a very individual challenge, an individual question. So, yeah, I think the answer for most people is yes, but I don't think the specifics of the answer are the same by any means from individual to individual. There was a time when I imagined that there might be an overarching answer to this question of why we're here. And I remember when I became disabused of that. I was about 15 or so, and it was on a very specific day. I was walking to school, and it just suddenly hit me. The most obvious thing in the world, this is not deep, so I'm setting this up far too grandiose, but it just suddenly hit me that if it were the case that there were a universal answer, everybody would know it because it would be passed down from generation to generation across cultures throughout the world. It would just be a fundamental truth that everybody was aware of. And because there wasn't any such fundamental answer that everyone agreed on to why we're here and what it's for, it must mean that there isn't one. And that just radically changed my perspective to one of, I guess what we ultimately need to do is make our own meaning. Because if there's not a universal one, what else could there be but an individual approach? And so I remember sort of feeling things shift a little bit with that recognition. So back to your original question, I do think every individual, part of why we're here is to build the architecture of a life that will feel to us as individuals gratifying, worthwhile, meaningful, a sense of purpose, a sense of accomplishing things that matter to us. But I think that's a highly individual journey.
Were you never at that age or before it ever swayed by any religion?
Not really. I mean, I grew up in a household that was culturally religious.
Okay.
Mostly because, my parents and I, Jewish tradition, this was just, a few decades after the Holocaust. There was definitely the sense of, the world is against us, that sort of mindset. And I certainly grew up in that framework. But it was much more group identity as opposed to theological belief. And so I never really had that aspect to deal with in any significant way growing up. Since then, I certainly have, explored these ideas, fairly diligently, but it was not part of my upbringing.
What about culturally? Did you regard yourself as Jewish culturally? Like, did you observe a lot of the traditions and
sort of?
Yeah.
It was much more haphazard than certainly some of my friends growing up, where they had a very systematic and rigid approach to the holidays and to the traditions and to Friday night. My dad was a composer and musician, and so Friday nights were the nights when he was out playing because that was a good night for making money. So our household, could not revolve around the usual time frame. And the Sabbath, Saturday, my dad take off a Saturday. He needed to be playing the bass fiddle at this or that bar mitzvah or wedding in order to put food on the table. So it was a different mindset.
That's why you got good at cooking, right?
Actually, it is true.
Yeah.
I started to cook significant number of meals for the family by like 10 or 11 years old.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, for sure. Now, that was also because at 9 years old, I decided I'd be vegetarian.
At 9?
At 9, yeah. And it was a very specific thing. My mom
When did you graduate college? 12?
No, I'm really not precocious in that way at all. But my mom cooked spare ribs when I was 9 years old. And it suddenly occurred to me on eating this this meat on a bone. This is an animal. And to that point, to me, it was just meat was something that came cellophane wrapped from the supermarket. It wasn't anything different from anything else from that point. But when I recognized that it was an animal, that's when I began to recognize this might not be for me.
And were you immediately vegan, or did you go vegetarian?
No, I went vegetarian first. In fact, my parents' initial reaction when I said I wasn't going to eat meat was to tell me that the salami sandwich that I'd made myself in place of the spare ribs, that's meat too. Thinking, okay, he'll give up this ridiculous idea. But no, I put down the salami sandwich. But pizza was a mainstay growing up, and cheese and things. So yes, that was certainly a part. But then much later on, I must have been in my early 20s, I think. Yeah, I went to Animal Sanctuary in Watkins Glen, New York, which is near Ithaca, New York, where I was a professor of physics. That was my first teaching job, was at Cornell. And I learned about the dairy industry, and I had no need to know about the dairy industry. But once I saw these animals that had been turned into kind of these factories for producing milk, and the whole dairy industry just abusing, that was it. It was within 72 hours of that visit, that was the last time I had any dairy.
Would you ever eat any dairy if it was like ethically produced?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, not at this stage.
Right.
Maybe back then, but I have gone so many decades now that it's just a way of being. In fact, it even turns into a little bit of a revulsion,
Interesting. Yeah, because I was going to say, is it like almost like if you were an alcoholic or something like that, and so you don't want to relapse?
That's right. It's less than that. Like, I'm not fearful of if I have some real mozzarella cheese instead of the vegan, I'll never be able to stop. It's just a sense that somehow it just feels wrong to me to imbibe animal products.
Right.
Now, I do wear animal products. Everybody draws a line in different places. Some people say, well, what about those leather shoes? And I say, well, I don't eat them. And that to me somehow...
Unless you're really hungry.
Unless I'm really hungry, which, that'll make the exception. But, you
got tenure, right?
Yeah, right. But no, yes, I haven't had anything of that sort since then.
Yeah, right. And so what are your usual things that you would eat week to week? Do you have staples, or do you mix it up? Because vegan diets can be reasonably narrow.
Yeah, it is definitely more narrow than you might have if you allowed everything in, of course, but not as narrow as I think many people would imagine. I mean, the things you can do with vegetables and with grains. And so I do mix it up some, but, Asian is perhaps the staple. Chinese, Indian are the Thai are sort of the main foods that I cook, and then it's just a matter of various combinations of vegetables and the tofu and the eggplant and sometimes the vegan cheese on occasion. Now they're things that are actually pretty good. So but it can be a challenge, especially during the pandemic. We spent 510 days at our place upstate because my son has an autoimmune condition. So we weren't going to take any chances. We just were really fully isolated. But I cooked dinner every single night for, family of 4, my wife and my 2 kids. And to keep that interesting after 500 days, I pushed my own, limits there, and I broadened, by being forced to do so.
How important do you think it is living in line with your values? And I don't just mean veganism, but any of your beliefs or values, and trying to live virtuously. Is that something that you're conscious of?
Not really. I don't consciously analyze the world in those terms. I think I sort of have, an average level of social concern, societal concern, a standard amount of, just wanting to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, sort of tautologically speaking. But I certainly know I have had friends where they ruminate, much like, Plato, on what is virtue, what is the virtuous life. And that doesn't pull me. To me, you just live and you recognize that we come together in these social groups and you behave in a way that allows you to be, but also allows the group as best it can to flourish, And so it's just a way of being as opposed to contemplating and thinking it through and making decisions based on kind of rational analysis of what is a life of virtue.
Yeah, I always find that I have this version of myself that I believe is the best version of myself, and the virtues that person possesses. And then there's me, and they're completely different fucking people. And I'm not even trying to be the other dude. I just thinking about who it is in my head and being like, oh, that'd be nice. But then I just never become them.
Right.
But I do admire some people for the virtuous lives that they live. Not just people who talk about it on Twitter, but people who do make decisions. And as long as they make decisions that drive up the cost of something in their life for something they believe in, I think I couldn't do it. Right. Veganism is one of those things.
But I don't do it to be virtuous. I really don't.
Whether you do or don't. I mean, if there is, I think that there's probably, I don't think it would be a good thing if everybody was vegan.
Actually, it might. I mean, climate change,
sure, but we'd find some other way to fuck it up, wouldn't we?
Yeah, probably.
I feel like, I'm always reading those things that are counter arguments to the vegan climate change things. Like if everybody started eating too much soy, then there would be,
no doubt. I mean, anything that goes out of balance, you have to see what's the new equilibrium that you settle in. I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
But for me, it's really just my own inner sense of engaging with the world. I just don't want to eat things that we're living in a way that's close to ours, and so that leads me to plants. Now, hopefully we won't one day learn that the plants are also, screaming when they're cut and that they've got a conscious awareness.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'd do at that point.
I was talking to Neil deGrasse Tyson a couple of weeks ago, and he thinks that they feel pain.
Yeah, well, he's tried to give me that argument. So, yeah, I mean, to me, it's sufficiently far away that it hasn't seeped into my way of thinking about things.
Sure.
But,
Well, that's a
and
good
he
segue.
loves that man is a huge meat eater. So just so it's really
yes,
clear. Yeah.
Did you know that for his last meal he actually selected something vegetarian?
Really?
Yeah.
Why would he do that?
Well,
he was depriving himself in the final hour.
Yes, he was. He didn't want the last thing that he did on the earth to have affected another living animal.
So he's virtuous in the last hour.
Exactly. He's fine.
You got to give
every day. I wasn't going to pick him up on that, but I was all right. Anyway, this is a great segue into your last meal, so I should present it to you.
Yes.
So Brian Greene, your last meal is
wow, very nice
tofu, broccolini in a black beans sauce.
I'm looking forward to tasting it.
I'm going to try a piece. You're going to try a piece, but then you're going to have
Now, I should just say,
if
my wife sees me eating without a napkin, she's going to be quite upset. But I'm fine without it. Just
we've got tissue. Tissue work.
Yeah, tissue. I just want to show her that I have learned my etiquette, which I didn't always have.
What's her name?
Tracy.
He's learnt his lesson.
Yes.
All right. He asked for the serviette.
She says, "How could anyone ever eat without a napkin?" So
it's true.
Here it
I'm
is.
about it. I'm only going to have it.
Good,
all right,
good.
let's go for it.
Okay, so I'm gonna.
All right. Let's try this.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not too bad.
Oh, nice amount of ginger you got in there too.
Yeah. I do garlic, ginger at the beginning.
Very, very nice. Yeah.
To kind of temper the oil.
Wow.
And then
and this is nice because it's soft interior.
Yeah, this is the kind of tofu you like.
Yeah, it's very nice, very nice.
But why wouldn't you pick? Oh, mate, I guess you kind of answered that already. But if it was your last meal, if you were going to die, if the world was ending, you could not technically, but you could realistically eat an animal product. Yeah. So the ethical part would be removed, I guess.
Right.
But is it just because you've developed such antipathy to?
Yeah, to the point where I can't even eat a fake meat burger.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I can't either.
But for instance, my daughter and my wife, they love the Beyond Burgers.
Oh, yeah.
I see them and I cook them for them, but I can't. They're too close. But more than that, like a thought did occur to me when you asked me, okay, what would your choice for a last meal be? And I was like, oh, maybe it's got to be adventurous. Like maybe that last meal should like send you off with something that you've never done. And I'm like, no, that's not who I am. I ultimately come back to home base.
Yeah.
And at the end, this to me is the big comfort food of my entire life,
Yeah.
so why wouldn't I, have that at the end?
Mm.
And so, but, the other thing is maybe the only non-vegan thing I could imagine doing is maybe like some real cheesecake.
Oh, yeah.
Perhaps that would be as far as I would go.
That's a very New York thing, isn't it? Cheesecake?
It is.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I continue to eat?
Absolutely. This is the whole point of the show. So eat, yeah. And I'm just going to make you feel awkward by asking questions while you're eating. So, if you got to choose the context within which you had your last meal, like the location, and maybe who you had present, you can pick anyone from history, by the way.
Oh, really?
Doesn't just have to be.
Yeah. Well, if it was a nice long meal, I mean, the final people that I'd want to be with, not to be too, conventional, but my wife and kids for sure,
of course,
without a doubt. But yeah, would it be wonderful to have Shakespeare for a little bit, to have, Isaac Newton for a bit, just to really get some sense of the minds that have shaped my own thinking about things, both from a humanist standpoint and from a scientific standpoint. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And maybe they could prepare me for the next phase if they were, coming back, So, but in the end, I'm not one of those people who looks at the end as a moment to make up for all the things that I didn't do. And that's sort of with the foods, not a moment to make amends for all the things that I wish I hadn't done or to say the things that I wish I would have said. I kind of live day to day saying those things and doing those things. I'm perhaps too aware of death, frankly. And again, going back to my son, who's like, Dad, I've like lived with death from I've been 2 years old or something, because it's constantly in my thinking about things.
I'm the same.
And so and that's why like the end to me is not some moment to do something extraordinary.
Yeah.
I like to think that if I'm going to do something different or extraordinary, it was part of the mainstream, not sort of the last moment.
So then, if it doesn't exist that moment to necessarily close any loops, but you were to have your family around for that last meal, then what kind of conversations do you think you'd be having with them?
Yeah. So again, it wouldn't be, I'm sorry for this, or I wish we would have, it wouldn't be like that, but it certainly would be, I imagine. And again, who knows when death is really staring you in the face, and I think we've all had moments when this or that medical think that maybe this could be the end. And of course, your mindset is certainly different initially when you have that sort of shocking sensibility. But putting that to the side, I would like it to be a moment of kind of, hey, I'm about to find out the answer to the big questions of the ages. You all should be excited. Because, if there is something else, I'm about to find out.
Yeah.
And the wonderful thing is, if there isn't anything else, I fucking won't know. So there's no reason to feel bad for me. So this is a win-win, and I think that's kind of the way I would approach it.
So what you want is to tell people that you're about to be vindicated about string theory on your deathbed. That's
right.
Basically...
That's right.
Okay. I like to sometimes ponder if the afterlife ended up being like a multiverse and you could meet one specific version of yourself. Who do you think that would be?
Well, the multiverse is a very strange thing if you think about it fully, because at least let's do the quantum mechanical version of the multiverse, sort of a traditional one. What the multiverse from quantum theory says, anything that's allowed by the laws of quantum physics will arise. anything allowed by the laws, which means if there's a non-zero probability for the particles in my brain to suddenly transition to a brain that's radically different, a brain of Greta Garbo, there's going to be a version of me who has memories of being Greta Garbo. I mean, that's how strange the multiverse is. So in a way, it's deeply uninteresting, because if everything happens, then
So what?
so what?
Yeah.
But let me just answer from a less physics standpoint and just for a more humanist standpoint. Sure, would it be interesting to see versions of yourself that took the path that you were struggling to do? Sure. That would be sort of interesting just to see how things turned out in that particular. Would it be interesting to somehow focus in on those versions of myself in the multiverse that are really close to this one? The ones that go far away, it's like, oh, okay, it's not even me any longer. But the ones that are really close, and say, is there a core part of the personality that always sort of threads its way through in all these different variations on the life that I have lived, and how do they manifest? Sure. I mean, I think it would be interesting to do that. But again, we're guaranteed, unless it's contradicted by the laws of physics, that's a version of me, who can sing like Pavarotti or Taylor Swift, for that matter, who has the moves of Michael Jackson. I mean, it's just like insane
the
what the
dance moves,
multiverse
right?
allows.
The dance moves.
Yes, exactly. So that and so that's the reason why, in a sense, when anything and everything can happen, you're like, is there anything interesting in there? Because it's all there.
I like to think about it just as obviously as an analogy, not on a scientific way, but of kind of like, if you could imagine a different version of yourself, it gets more and more interesting when we think of very close to us, but just a little bit different.
Yeah.
Because it's too much to try to imagine people that are too far away from us.
Right. In fact, they're not even us.
They're not yet. Well, none of them are us.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
None of them are us.
That's right. But the ones that are like so close that you really can recognize yourself.
Yes.
And perhaps even the thought process that version of you went through in deciding to go left versus right, or to choose this versus that. And so there is a certain kind of appeal to saying, I think I just spat out a piece of rice, to seeing what reality is like for an individual that is so close to you, but it's not actually you.
Yeah. And I think the reason I like it as a thought experiment is because it really sort of hones in on which aspects of your own life and yourself do you think it would have been interesting if we're different?
Right.
And maybe there's a dissatisfaction you have with some aspect of your personality or something like that.
Yeah.
Do you have anything like that?
Well, I don't consider myself, not that there is a typical scientist, but even my day-to-day life now as a scientist is fairly different from many of the lives of my colleagues. And my own life as it was 30 years ago. My life 30 years ago was much more scientific convention. I went to the office. I worked with my graduate students. I struggled to figure out this or that quality of the world. I wrote papers on it. And each paper was a stepping stone for the next paper. And the goal was to try to advance knowledge and go to conferences and speak about these ideas. It was the very conventional rhythm. That was exciting. It was wonderful. And then at some point I segued to spending a significant part of my time writing books and giving lectures and being out there trying to help more general public ideas about refining the general public's ideas of how physics works and things of that sort. Do I wonder at times what things might have been if I hadn't ever made that turn and was just still 100% 15 hours a day pushing the equations and the idea? Yeah, there is. So would I be curious to see that world and how far I got when I decided not to have any distraction from the core scientific research? Yeah, there's a part of me that would be curious about that.
How do you think that would have turned out for you?
I don't know. I think it's obvious when you shine a light on it, but there are very few people like an Einstein for whom it almost doesn't matter. Einstein was going to have big breakthroughs. I mean, he just had such deep insight. And then even when you look at his life, there's serendipity too that played a vital role there too. But, I don't have that raw capacity the way Einstein and way some scientists of very few of our age do. So it would really be a question of the amount of raw ability that I have, which is non-zero, but not Einsteinian, and how it would have been molded by circumstance and by the environment and by interactions and hard work. So I don't know. And that's why perhaps now the funny thing about the multiverse is there's a version of me as a pure scientist that did really well. And he maybe even won the Nobel Prize. And there's a version of me that, didn't do well at all and didn't get tenure.
There's working at Blockbuster and then Netflix
right.
came out.
That's right. So it's just to say that where one's life goes is so contingent upon so many small, tiny elements of how you have interacted with the world that it's only partly you. It's really the entire engagement, if at all. That's right.
What do you think was the pivotal moment that projected you or turned your life from being pure scientist to communicator, let's say?
Well, when I trace it back, it's been there for a long time. I was kind of shocked that we were cleaning out some papers years ago now, and I came upon the essay that I wrote for college, the personal statement that you write down. And right in there, as I want to do research on space and time and blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. And I want to bring the public into these ideas. I think I was inspired by two people. I mean, certainly Carl Sagan to some extent, but it was actually Jacob Bronowski, who wrote a book, about human culture and really traced the history of the big ideas. And he had a book on this, and he had a television show called The Ascent of Man, I believe it was called, if I'm remembering correctly. And somehow he just really pulled me into the value of taking knowledge and putting it out there in a way that people could get excited about, that they could grasp, they could feel that they get it. And that really became part of the way I thought about things pretty early on. So it's not as though I was following some roadmap, I don't think, but it's also not as though there was just some random thing that happened that, pushed me in the direction of spending time doing what I do.
Do you think you've always had a natural propensity to be a storyteller, to be, a communicator at heart? Like, was there something about you that you knew differentiated you from other people in the academic field?
Well, again, it's weird that there was a specific moment. It was during a high school class, which had the very bizarre name called hygiene. We had a class called hygiene. And it was, why they called it hygiene, I don't know. But it was really all about like first aid and cleaning wounds and CPR. And it was all that sort of stuff. Now, clearly there wasn't enough material to fill a whole semester. And every student had to take this class. It was not optional. It was at Stuyvesant High School. I suspect they don't still do it. And so what the teachers did was they charged each student with taking some topic of tangential relevance to this class and teaching the class about that topic. And most of the kids who did it was kind of boring, and most people would just be sort of fiddling. There were no phones back then, but, not really paying attention. I decided I was going to really take this really seriously, and I chose the topic of dreams, and I did all this research on what was then known about dreaming in humans, dreaming in animals, the Freudian interpretation, the ways in which people had studied people in dream states. And I really worked hard and turned this into a vibrant presentation that really did grab the class. And at that moment, I sort of like, wow, maybe there's some way that I have a bit of a talent for taking these ideas and bringing them to people in a way that will kind of grab them.
Yeah, wow.
You know.
And that's a young age for you to have
Yeah, it
discovered
was.
that.
Yeah. So whatever age you are in 11th grade, 16 or 17 or something like that. Yeah.
You seem to have hit so many milestones, like 10 years earlier than most people. You're like vegan at 9. I was controlling the classroom when I was 17. Got to have Columbia at 12. I was actually going to ask when you're a kid, sort of, so before all the lessons and classrooms, I guess, hit, is there a memory that you have that was your first sensation of awe at something?
Wow. Let me just freeze what happened to come to mind when you asked the question.
Sure.
And I just an aside, often I find that, like, if I have a memory of something, I ask myself, like, why do I remember that instead of that?
I always think that.
And it's usually that there's some kind of meaning either that was intrinsic to the event, or I'm also a firm believer that we constantly rewrite the story of our lives, sort of injecting an overlay of meaning, and somehow the brain, latches on to things. So the thing that came to mind for me is, I mentioned my dad was a musician, composer, and so we had very little money growing up. And one of the things that my dad did was he wanted to give us some time out of the city. We were always in the city growing up. We didn't have a country house or something. And he was offered a job where he would play bass fiddle on the weekends in a bungalow colony, it was called. I don't know where,
What was that?
It was this like summer retreat, not high end. It was very low end, Anyway, we went to this place and we were basically sharing a house that had been divided in half with a family over here, and we were on this side. And I was around 5 years old or something. And every morning I would go out and sit on the steps, because the sun would be coming down, and I loved the sensation of the sun on my legs, and I'd just sit there. And I remember one morning I looked back, and in the other part of the house, the other family, was a real elderly man. It must have been like the grandfather of that family. And I as I've thought about that memory on occasion, and it's one that came to mind, obviously as a 5-year-old, I wasn't having deep thoughts. So I'm sure this is like injecting from the outside, but it kind of felt to me like there's the spectrum of life. You got this like young kid at the beginning of his life, sort of out there, enjoying the sunlight and thinking about going forward. And there you have this elderly man behind the screen door. He was behind the screen door, who's sort of now, at the end of his life, and just sort of looking out from behind this barrier where sort of his life has sort of reached sort of the end of its journey. And somehow that feeling, I imagine having a sensation back then as a little kid of, this is what it is. This is the spread, from the beginning to the end, and whether it was awe, it was definitely some intuitive sensation that this is part of a journey that we've all been on and will be on. And, here I am sitting here. I'm not that far away from, where he was behind the screen door,
You'll be behind the screen door next. You see a little 5-year-old sitting in the sun, you're like, shit. That little prick is thinking about me.
So.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very deep thought for a 5-year-old to be having.
And again,
I'm not surprised.
But again, no doubt that I'm rewriting, which is again what we do. But there's nothing wrong with that. I think what the act of living is a constant sort of reanalysis of the journey that we are all on, and a constant revising. I mean, look, when I write, I revise each page 1,000 times. I mean, over it. And so that's, I think, what we do with our lives as well.
What's a simple, everyday thing that happens in life that still baffles you despite your scientific understanding?
Still baffles. Well, my wife gets very upset if the dishwasher is not loaded in exactly the right way. And I've been unable to crack the code of how the dishes are meant to go in, where she won't get upset. Other everyday things, I don't. I'm making her sound awful. She's wonderful. I'm making her sound awful. But how she makes the bed with such tautness on the sheets, I'm unable to figure out how that's done.
That's good. Yeah, I don't know how people do that.
Packing. I don't know how to take a button shirt and fold it in a way that doesn't look like just like you've shoved a ball of material into.
She does this.
She does it.
She does it, right. Yeah. Are there any things that baffle you about day-to-day life that don't involve your wife?
She also gives great clarity, too.
Yeah.
But yes.
So no was the short answer to that question. Yeah. What is an experience that you had that you think was worth every cent?
Well, if I interpret every last cent as not money per se, but just the emotional or the maybe even the terror that was involved in it, years ago, I'm not a skier, and I was with a friend at the time in Sweden. And we were going on a green. She was an expert skier. I was a novice. But we were going on the green, the easy trail. Okay. Little did we know that this particular green dead-ended after a gentle downhill in a double diamond. You had to go down a double diamond for the last part of this journey. And you couldn't go back because it was like uphill, long, And so I was faced with, oh, my God, what am I going to do? And somehow I was able to commit to something that I couldn't possibly do. And I'm sure I was not elegant, but I was able to somehow get down to where we needed to go. And I've thought about that on occasion. It's the obvious thing, how we can sometimes just rise to the moment. And that was such a concrete and early version of that it really stuck with me. And so, it was terrifying. I was like, what am I? And yet, in the end, it felt as though it would help propel me forward, Do
you think that that's sometimes those containers are necessary for us to achieve the best version of ourselves?
Yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, the things that I look back on that matter to me most are certainly the ones where there was a real opportunity for failure and a real opportunity even for public failure. And so the willingness to put yourself in that position, at least for me, and look, had they turned into failure, I might have been saying things differently right now. So there's also, the ends justifying the means type of attitude here. But I certainly am thankful that I was willing on various occasions to risk looking foolish, looking ridiculous in order to perhaps do something that pushed me as a person forward.
Yeah. Do you think that people learn better through doing or being told?
There's no question that it's through doing. And concretely, I would sit in physics class, even in, college, graduate school, sort of understanding what was going on. And I could really tell that my classmate colleagues were getting it much more because they were learning by being told.
Yeah.
But then I just got to the point where I was like, I know that I will go home and I will do. I will get into the nitty-gritty details of what it is that we're talking about. And by the time I get through on the other side, I will be where I need to be. And so that's the way I have always approached everything. It is always a matter of doing.
Do you take the same approach with your kids? Would you rather them learn by themselves or for you to teach them?
Well, to learn by doing doesn't have to be by yourself. I think instruction in the right way can be very much an active process as opposed to the passive process of, I know stuff and I'm going to somehow put it inside your head by telling you how things are. And I've always pushed my kids. I mean, I have worked with them a lot. I'd love to work with my kids, but it is almost always in the context of getting them from A to not B, but like halfway to B, and then pushing them to take it the next step of the journey. And oftentimes, no, just tell me, Dad. Just tell me, Dad. And to resist that is really important. I mean, not that I always
Difficult,
have.
I imagine, as well.
Yeah.
Because you want to give them everything that they want.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
What's a lesson that, had you learnt it earlier in life, would have changed your life for the better?
Well, for a long time, my view was that there were mathematical truths about reality. And it was our job as physicists to find those mathematical truths. And there might even be a final mathematical truth. This image that Einstein had of like the unified theory. That was sort of what always drove me, for a long time. I then slowly had what I consider ultimately to be an epiphany, which not everybody agrees with. This is really controversial. But my view is that all those mathematical ideas are made up. They're human constructs. Much as we were describing earlier, we take in data, influences from the external world. Our brain tries to tell coherent stories. And if you're a physicist, it tries to tell a mathematical story, a predictive mathematical story. And we come up with these narratives that we can articulate in the language of mathematics. But they're human narratives. They're very specific and precise, and they make predictions. And if they agree with our observations, we say, oh, this is a good narrative. And we push that narrative further. And if it makes predictions that don't agree, we're like, oh, that's a bad narrative. We put that to the side. But the notion that somehow we are discovering fundamental truth is one that I've had to put away because I don't believe it any longer. We are inventing mathematical descriptions, and the best physicists tell the best mathematical stories. And that, to me, is a radically different way of thinking about what we're doing.
Fucking oath it is.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an extremely controversial position for you to be taking right now.
Yeah. And not one that I had felt early on.
When did you start feeling like
Last
this?
10, 15 years, maybe.
Interesting. And the original question was posed as to something that would have changed your life for the better if that's what you'd thought younger, to paraphrase. And so are you trying to say that you would have had a better experience if you were less dogmatic about the approach you took to?
Well, and again, not to get nitpicky, like I try to stay away from the whole concept of regret.
Sure.
Just because I don't believe in free will either. So I just like to observe what this collection of particles happen to do along the timeline. And it's just an interesting story to watch what has unfolded. So it's not so much that I sort of regret that I didn't think about that way earlier, but I will say that thinking about things this way has opened up my world in a fairly radical way. Early on, I was not interested in human beings. I was like, that's just like the momentary flux on the fundamental truth. Who cares about human interactions, emotions? It's all about discovering the fundamental truth. That's what. But then when you recognize that, you're not actually doing anything different than the human narrative. You're just using a different language. Instead of English, you're using mathematics. And instead of trying to describe, the development of the species or the interactions of individuals, sure, you're focusing on electrons and neutrons and things of that sort. But in the end of the day, you're just telling another story, a powerful predictive story. So I don't want it somehow to denigrate science. That's not my point at all. I'm not talking about some sort of major relativism, that there's no fundamental prediction or qualities of the world that you can count on. No, I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that the activity is really analogous to what Dostoevsky was doing, what Shakespeare was doing, what Faulkner was doing. We are trying to find narratives that speak to certain kind of qualities of the external world. And had I thought about things that way earlier on, I think my world would have opened up earlier. I'm deeply interested in human beings now.
Yeah.
I'm deeply interested in all sorts of narratives, from the evolution of language to the evolution of myth and religion and storytelling itself. And so that interest has been fueled by this distinct way of looking at what we as physicists do.
Yeah, that's a great answer. If I told you that January 1st next year, you are going to wake up and repeat a year of your life, you don't get to change anything about it, but you just get to experience it again, like you're watching a film. Do you have an age or a year that would be? And if so, why?
Yeah. So again, not to be nitpicky, but if I was just experience it identically to what happened, that would feel to me almost like not doing anything at all. Because like I think those moments still exist at the moment where they took place, but let's not go to that.
Yeah, that's a bit space-timey.
Yeah, that's right. But if I just interpret it more broadly in terms of, was there a year that like was particularly like meaningful to me, what would that be? It might sound funny, but I think it would be 10th grade. And I'll tell you why.
Is this when you graduated from Columbia? Or?
No, yeah. And the reason is, when I was in 10th grade in high school, I was on the wrestling team. And there was something about being on a team that was so focused on a very atavistic human activity, which is battle, one person against another trying to pin them to the ground, that it created a certain kind of closeness in that group of these young, scrappy kids that were just, coming together to try to achieve, a championship season. And we came so close in that season, as it turned out. And there's something about the connection that happened in that year that, in memory, again, maybe I'm rewriting it, that just feels so special to me in looking back.
Was it the people, or was it the actual experience of the first time of being in a team?
It was all of that. It was somehow being together in a motley group that was so dedicated to the achievement of each other, because wrestling is an interesting sport. It's a team sport, but each of the individual matches are individuals. So it's this blend of the individual and the collective. And somehow in my memory, it feels like this was a really rich balance of people just so invested in the success of everybody else and so dedicated to doing whatever we could so that the group would succeed. And there was something so meaningful about being part of that group that I find myself, strangely enough, what are we talking about here? Like 45 years later? 45, spontaneously in my mind, I'll think back to moments in that season. And so if you ask me, what would be one that would be... Now, if I were to relive it, I have little doubt it won't live up to the story that I've told myself about what it was. So maybe I should just leave it alone.
Yeah.
But in terms of a year that comes to mind, that's the one.
It seems like a bit of a loop close, because it appears almost that you always had this faith in humanity and an interest that you now have returned to after so many years.
Yeah, right. I think so.
Brian Greene, thanks so much for sitting down with me today. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Really
I hope you enjoyed your last meal.
I did. Yes, I did.
And we're going to do this again sometime.
Absolutely.
For someone who lives in the tension between the furnace of the infinitesimal and the cold laws of the cosmos, Brian Greene struck me as unusually warm. He doesn't chase meaning, he builds it. It seems more and more that he questions everything. An earmark less of knowledge than it is of wisdom. A stark reminder to us all: stay curious, stay kind, and never let go of wonder.